Hey, we're looking good. It is 6:30 on a Tuesday night, and where else would you be but here at the High Path Avian Influenza Situational Update on November 8th. Thanks for joining us. Once again, this series is brought to us through funding we received from the CAP program, and we're delivering this in partnership with OMAFRA to continue that outreach and information. So as always, all the links and the recordings are going to be available on the Biosecurity and Disease webpage once we get the video all prettied up and loaded onto the YouTube. And I just wanted to do a recap because we're halfway through the series. So this is session number 7. Last week was number 6, and I think we're doing 12 if all goes well. So thanks for joining us. I know a lot of folks have tuned in every single week, which is super great. We've had 12 committed speakers, folks who've come on. We don't play sports around here. We just jump onto High Path Avian Influenza webinars, but just sharing a lot of great information, and that's going to continue on tonight and moving forward. We've had about 200 people tune in live, 350 plus views on our YouTube channel, and I summed up the questions because I think that's also really interesting. We've had 79 questions asked this fall, asked and answered. And I just wanted to give another little shout out to an OMAFRA resource. So if you're working in the industry and you're working in the client-facing space, there's a great little webinar that was posted, and it's available on our Biosecurity and Disease webpage as well. So please check that out. And another shameless plug. So we've got Christophe Wand talking about small flocks and winter, and that like how you manage that moving forward. But every spring, PIC, in partnership with OMAFRA, we deliver a 3-hour webinar with a live Q&A on how to set your flock up for success through the year as you get your new chicks in. So I just wanted to have everyone mark their calendars in case that's of interest to you. We have the next one coming up in March, but the recording of this past year is still available, plus some materials and a really good slide deck. So that's for a pretty low price of $25. So available through our website now. And as usual, we've got a little bit of an agenda lined up, which is great. So we've got our friends from CFIA. They're going to give us a pretty quick update and just a little status update, if they can, on where the current active sites are at. As I mentioned, Christophe Wand is going to talk through winter is coming, all things that might need a little bit of preparation and some thought. And then we're joined tonight by Dr. Mike Petrick, who works at McKinley Hatchery, and he's going to talk about diseases in addition to high path avian influenza, because there's still all sorts of other things that you want to be watching and monitoring for and taking care of. And then we're going to do, as always, our live Q&A, and we've got Dr. Brian Stevens on if you have any wild bird questions. So as usual, feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A and ask away. So I'm going to turn it over to Vaishnavi.
Thank you, Ashley. Good evening, everyone. Happy to be here again today to present just a few updates from CFIA. Before we go over like the fall outbreak timeline and where the milestones are, just wanted to quickly let the folks know that we haven't had any new sick bird calls since the last time, and there hasn't been any new IP. So good news on that end, and touch wood, it stays that way. Just wanted to quickly run down on the fall outbreak and where we are at and what the milestones look like. In that regards, so we had total 11 infected premises this fall. So I'm just going to start from IP infected premise 27. That's the first one that came up this fall, to 37, and quickly go over like the milestones of it and just what we have achieved so far. So infected premise 27, we have reached primary decon and was completed, and we have begun post-outbreak surveillance since November 1st. So if everything goes well, we should be able to release the primary control zone by the end of this month. Just as an FYI, when we do a post-outbreak surveillance, it's a 28-day period. We do surveillance or testing during those periods, and based on the results, if everything is fine, then we'll release the primary control zone. So anywhere I basically talk about post-outbreak surveillance, it's going to be kind of the same timeline, 28 days, so we can calculate how that's going to kind of turn around based on when it got started. infected premise 28, the cleaning and disinfection has started. There's no PCZ around this IP. Not much of a progress at the moment, unless and until like the cleaning and disinfection side of things. IP 29, there was restrictions removal from this infected premise yesterday. No PCZ around this IP as well, since it's non-poultry, non-commercial. IP 30, there's not much progress going on. We are working with other provincial bodies to on this particular IP, so we're just waiting on a few things before we can move further. IP 31, the post-outbreak surveillance is going to be completed in the next few days, and the PCZ revocation, if everything goes well, is planned to be removed on November 12th. IP 32, not much to update on the milestone side of things, so I'm going to leave that for now. IP 33 as well reached primary decontamination and has started post-outbreak surveillance today. IP 34, primary decon was also completed, and post-outbreak surveillance has started since October 22nd. This IP also had the infected zone release, and restrictions on the IP was released as well. IP 35, not much to update, so we'll come back to this later in the next few calls. IP 36 and IP 37 both had their primary decon completed as well and are under post-outbreak surveillance as of October 26th and November 5th, respectively. So that's pretty much like the updates from our end based on the fall IPs that we have. It's pretty good. Most of them with the primary control zone are in post-outbreak surveillance, which is of course good news. And if everything goes well, they are going to be released, revoked sooner than later. And that's pretty much it from my end. So I'll turn it over to Ashley, and I'll answer any questions at the end of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dash. And thanks once again for joining us for the last 7 weeks. I understand that you're spelling off, and Tori will be joining us from your team, so that's great. Take it away, Christoph.
If you can see that, Ashley.
Looking good.
Okay, perfect. Good evening, everyone. Just want to give a quick tip. I realize this is for many of you, this is not your first rodeo going into winter, but maybe some value you can get out of some of these things are for people that are going into their first winter with poultry or birds in general. Maybe some things of value to you here today. All these slides with this gray skin are actually Al Dam's, and Ashley made a good plug for some of the other programming he's involved with that course. So if you like these slides, come back for the full deal from Al, and perhaps you can do that. So it takes work to overwinter birds, and really what you want to do is make sure that they're properly sheltered, fed, and watered, that your building is weatherproof. This one being a key point, and this is the time. We've had this great open weather to get that coop clean and get out all that wet litter and all that manure under perches and such. The other thing is moving air and ventilation. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and ventilation is not a draft, and this keeping out uninvited pests. Ventilation tends to be the biggest issue with overwintering birds. Many people have this tendency as things get cold to start closing up their buildings, and this is when we see issues with that in terms of these respiratory issues. So that stale air in your building, it has all the junk in it, right? So all that dust, and poultry dust is nasty stuff, or pigeon dust is nasty stuff. We want to get that out as well as all their exhalation gases, and we want to bring fresh air in. So you want these vents to be adjustable, right? So you want the size of ventilation that you would bring in summer to be different than in the winter, but you don't want to close it right up again, as mentioned. And also, if you are in the process of or have the opportunity to renovate or building or whatever, think about where you bring air into the building. Generally speaking, in barn ventilation, you bring in air high, so it can come down as opposed to bring in at ground level and being drafting. Here's an example that Al put together for you, and these are, again, Al Dam slides. And this is a commercially available, essentially a small heat exchanger that you can get commercially. And this just shows you how you might use this for a small flock application. So a few different pictures of it. So there's something from the brochure from the spec here at the bottom. And then in the top center, you're seeing a picture of the outside image of it. And then on the right side, you're seeing an image of the product itself. And then also you are seeing a coop or inside building view with, here's a heat source, if you can see my cursor, and then there's your exchanger up there performing its function. So the idea is, again, trying to strike that balance between air movement and keeping some of that warmth in without tightening your building up too far. This issue around bedding is important, right? So we want to make sure that we're providing lots of thick bedding. It has its own insulation value, but it also provides a buffer to the moisture within the building. And then stay on top of those wet spots. Many of you that are running cold lofts or cold coops, you'll actually see that manure freeze up over the winter. So obviously you want to get on that when you have thaws and get those out and manage those wet spots, because this is your ammonia source, right? This bedding, the moisture from your birds, this is where it's going to reside and come back into the building. So you can do your air quality a favor by removing it before it comes up into the building. Extra nutrition. It's one of the things that many poultry and pigeon people I recognize from some of the names who are returning guests, that some of you are pigeon fanciers as well. Many people like dabbling in their own rations. So even though there's commercially available diets, people, will dabble in something that looks like this. If you can see this, this is, sometimes you see it as scratch grains or it's a grain blend. The one I just showed you there is winter wheat, barley, corn. So sometimes people like feeding that, and some people recognize, the addition of peas and flax and such to them as well. But what I want to put a call out to all of you, what you don't know about me, many of you, is that my training, my background before I did my current work is I'm trained as a livestock nutritionist. And so one of the things in commercial products, and so here's an example of a pellet. And so even if you're interested in mixing your own grains, so this pellet I'm holding here, you can essentially use that as a supplement to make sure you're delivering vitamin A, D, and E. So when you go into that wintering condition and you have birds that are do not have access to forage or a lot of sunlight, you get into this propensity for lacking the sunshine vitamin and lacking the fresh feed vitamins in the forms of A and E. So those commercial feeds are designed to do that. And again, many of you will be used to feeding crumbles, if you can see that, crumble type feeds to your layers. And so again, this is what we'd call a short pellet. So that's a small pellet. And again, there's entire diets available of that. But what I'm saying to you is find a way, if you're building your own diets, to incorporate some of those commercial materials. They're going to eat more of that in the winter, obviously. For energy, they're going to consume more of that feed. And egg production is also going to go down unless essentially you're running a timer. But come back and learn all about photoperiod and that. And again, many of you, this is not your first rodeo, so you'll know about day length and feed. So I just showed you those feed samples, and you might think this has nothing to do with anything, but I just want to say, at OMAFRA, we do other stuff than just worry about diseases. So what you just saw there was a map of Ontario and a link that we'll put in the chat to our annual mycotoxin survey in corn. And what I want you to see on this slide, for those of you, again, that are worried about feed quality, we have one thing on our side this year for sure. Our grain crop is very clean, okay? So DON is one of the mycotoxins we worry about. Vomitoxin, you may hear it discussed as. And as you can see, our 2022 crop is very clean, okay? So you should be able to buy and consume poultry and bird feeds with a lot of confidence this year. The crop looks pretty good. So here's another opportunity for you all. If you're not already into the business of this winter dust bath, I would suggest to you that you have this opportunity in your small flock situation to use diatomaceous earth as a dust bath. And again, many of you will know chickens really like dust bathing. So here's an opportunity for you to provide an enrichment, right? So those scratch grains I showed you before, those, just whole grain diets are one form of enrichment for birds where they can peck and choose and enjoy stuff. And here's another one too, to help you with bird health. Talking a little bit about freezing or preventing freezing in waters. Certainly when you get into a water like the unit in the bottom right of the screen, as you're seeing, some of those are going to present challenges in staying frost free. And some of these other options you then see coming into play are, for example, in the center of this the slide, and many of you will be familiar with those heated fountains. They're pretty expensive on the whole compared to other equipment. And sometimes when power goes out or whatever, they're going to freeze anyway. So sometimes having backup equipment that you can switch out because plastic breaks. And so as soon as it freezes, chipping ice out of these waters is not where you want to be. Top left of your screen is just heat tape. And so you can go to the hardware store and use those. So there's some options out there for you, and you can figure out those on the internet. What not to use. So that first image that came up is the power bar, the overloaded power bar. Those things that were just suggested to you, you know, people have this tendency as they're trying to pull it together, you know, maybe to add power, put in a power bar. Barn fires is a challenge. Poultry dust is a challenge. It gets into electrical stuff and can burn. So think about that when you're, whether it's a small little loft or you're more serious into semi-commercial poultry. This heater, this black heater box, you know, that you get at most hardware stores, they're pretty convenient. They're pretty cheap. They are not meant for livestock enclosures, whether birds or otherwise. The dust that livestock produce is bad news to both the electronics and a tendency to create a situation where you can create fiery sparks. And certainly we never want to be using you know, a propane fired unit or something as a heat source. So think about that. Again, there's this balance about maintaining fresh air. It is a balancing act, fresh air, keeping some residual heat so everything doesn't freeze, but not falling into some of these other problematic means of solving your problems. Predation and pests. So that's one of the challenges once you bring birds into a building. And for some of you, that's probably one of the things you were thinking about, you know, as you're trying to protect them from the viral load outside, bringing them into buildings earlier than you wanted to. This is maybe one of the things you're worried about. And again, for those of you who've seen this before, you will know it. But for those of you who haven't been through a winter, just know that mink, raccoon, Cooper hawk are just some of the ones I've named here. They can get access into poultry and pigeon structures through holes that those birds themselves cannot get out of. It seems unfeasible and unbelievable, but it is possible, and they do it. And the problem is that once we're into this cycle, the only way to solve it is either to get rid of the predator or the food source. So we either need to cut the food source off, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about a mink or a rat or a mouse. We either need to cut off the bird supply to the carnivores or the grain supply to those rodent pests. So just think about exclusion as you're looking at your lofts going forward. So just back to some of these high points here that Al and I would want to share with you, is that the goal is with these birds is that we want to keep them sheltered, fed, and watered. We want to prevent the weather getting into this building. We want to keep this building clean. Make sure you move air. Again, avoid that tendency to close up the building, bottle up that air in an attempt to keep in warmth, but also then you end up bottling up that bad air. Let's get that air out. Let's find another way to keep your water, your feed, your birds functioning and warm enough, and make sure we're keeping out these uninvited guests. Because the thing I haven't said through this whole thing is that each of these practices also assists us with the ability to keep this viral load out that all of our webinars have been about. Ashley, I think that's it for me.
Hey, I'll take it. That's a really great overview. And I posted a little link to the OMAFRA Raising Healthy Small Flocks link. So there's more deep information there. And that kind of twigged in my mind that when you're perusing the internet for any of the types of information that Christoph just shared, just really make sure that it's from a reputable source, or it's from a source that understands Ontario winters, for example. Particularly when you're looking for equipment. We've had a few inquiries just through this series, where can I get XYZ piece of equipment? So we've got members who are suppliers, and the benefit to that is they can tell you about what will fit best for the size of coop or the different, you know, sorts of structures that you're building for them. So really just rely on those good experts, I guess, is where I'm going with that. And speaking of which, our next expert is up, Dr. Mike Petrick. And again, we're talking about endemic diseases. Feel free to pop in your questions and answers, or questions, I guess, in the bottom tab there.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's nice to be able to talk to everyone. It's been an interesting fall, and there's been worries all over, but it seems like things have simmered down now. There's still a fair bit of avian influenza that's present, especially east and west of us. So Manitoba, Alberta, and Quebec are quite busy right now with outbreaks. We've been lucky or well managed, or maybe a little bit of both, and things have been quiet here for a little while, but it is pretty early to start relaxing. So keep your biosecurity up. Keep an eye out for suddenly sick and very ill birds. If you do see birds that are either suddenly dead or very quickly extremely ill, definitely reach out to a veterinarian or the CFIA and report that. It is important for us to know what the viral load is and how many affected flocks we have. But on another note, when the forest fire is over, you still have to worry about all the other things that are still percolating along. And as Christoph mentioned, coming into the fall is a really common time to start seeing diseases that may have been simmering through the summer. I'm not sure exactly why, but the humidity and the change in temperature of the fall and the spring seems to almost cause more disease or more symptoms than we even see during the dead of winter. So it's this transition time where we're at risk of seeing a lot of diseases. Probably one of the most common things that we hear about this time of year is coccidiosis. Especially if you've had young birds that have been out, in the dry grass and out, with a fair bit of space during the summer, lots of fresh air, lots of sunshine, and then they start to become more concentrated in the coop or just in a small run around the coop. That fecal oral transmission, where they'll pick at each other's droppings, is a real bad time for them to start getting an overload of these bugs that attack the gut and cause damage. And depending on what level of the gut they attack, you'll get different signs. The one that everyone worries about and is the most noticeable is if you get bloody droppings. It's a strain of the bug called Eimeria tenella that lives in the hind end of the gut. So the damage they causes bleeding. And since it's at the, almost the outflow end, when the droppings come out, there will be blood in them. There are 4 other species of Eimeria that can affect your bird, but they cause damage further up the gut. And by the time that ingesta continues on, the blood will be digested and absorbed, and it won't show up as bloody droppings. But you'll still get a sick bird, ruffled feathers, not moving very much, probably not eating very much. She'll have quite a bellyache and not, and not do well. So again, work with a veterinarian, take fecal samples, even if your birds are on medicated feed. Medicated feed has Amprol in it, or Corid if you're from the States, and that is in at a very low level and will keep your birds relatively protected. But we still see plenty of breaks on medicated feed. Now, medicated feed does help a lot, and so we see a lot less breaks than we would if they're not medicated, but it's still not perfect. So even if your birds are on medicated feed and they look like they're sick with gut issues, one of the best things you can do is, if you can take the bird in, great, but if not, take some droppings and get them to do a fecal float and look for cocci. It's simple to treat and it gets better relatively quickly, but you need to get on it. You can't let them sit there and suffer with that for a while. Or sometimes the damage to the gut will be too much to repair. Again, with the birds getting into tighter quarters, poor air quality. Natural ventilation in some of these coops isn't as good as you want it to be. Sometimes it's hard to keep the litter as clean and dry as you want. So ammonia and dust are their own problems. What they also do is make the bird much more susceptible to especially respiratory diseases. So ILT, infectious bronchitis, mycoplasmas, all are going to show up more during the fall and early winter than they're going to during the summer. So again, the unfortunate part about chickens is they're tough as nails and they're hard to read. And so very, very often I get a call for a bird that's very suddenly sick. And then we'll get looking at these birds and find out that they've actually been sick for a while, but they hide it really well. So if you see a bird that's puffing, that's ruffled feathers, again, down, not eating, a sick bird looks like a sick bird, and it's really subtle differences between what looks like a bird that's sick with gut things versus a bird that's sick with respiratory things. Watch for their sinuses. Watch for dust actually to stick just beside the nostril. You'll see that a lot more than you'll actually see nasal discharge. So if it gets wet around their nostrils, you'll know that's because they've got a respiratory issue, and you'll see crusty either feed or dust around the nostrils, which will give you a hint that it might be respiratory. Again, try and do a workup on these animals. It's getting harder and harder for you to just go and find antibiotics, which is a good thing. We need to only use the antibiotics that are effective and that are appropriate. So if you can get your birds to a vet, get some testing done and get appropriate antibiotics, that's better than, a lot of people used to have a bottle of Tylenol or a bottle of liquamycin, and they would see birds look a little bit off and they'd treat them. And it was like using a sledgehammer to drive a finishing nail. We don't need that, and it's also not anywhere near the best for the birds. So the more accurate and precise the treatment can be, the better it'll be for everyone. Again, the human health risks of having your own birds can't be ignored. It gets more risky, I guess, when the birds get more concentrated. So washing your hands, keeping your eggs sanitary, things like that. Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli. The birds will definitely have salmonella. There's a real good chance that there's Campylobacter around. That's not an uncommon flora of a chicken. And some of the birds will have salmonella. So make sure you're keeping the birds or the eggs clean, any food products, you handle them properly. And, like I said, the more concentrated the birds are, the more concentrated the bugs are. And so you need to be very aware this time of year and all through the winter that you don't catch something that you really don't want to. And then I guess the one last thing is there is blackhead around. Okay, so it's a complicated disease that it's a protozoa that goes through a worm and then they eat the worm, but it causes severe disease in especially turkeys. If you have turkeys and chickens together, that's a real danger. Chickens can handle blackhead a lot better than turkeys can. But if you have them mixed, again, because of the heightened awareness of avian influenza, if you suddenly see quite sick birds, it is really important to get them looked at and get them tested out. The nice thing is that it's going to help with things like cocci. It's going to help with things like blackhead, where an early diagnosis makes the treatment a lot more effective. And I think I'll leave it there. We could go on and on about this. Good nutrition, good water, and good ventilation go a long, long way in keeping your flock healthy. You can have what seems to be a very isolated flock and very little disease challenge, but if the environment challenges them, you'll see a lot more sick birds than well-run birds that are in the middle of a whole bunch of chickens. So again, try and keep those stressors down, and that'll help the birds, keep an equilibrium with any of the bugs that are in their environment. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. So I just popped a little link. So some of the names of the diseases that Dr. Patrick were naming are in there. And then there's, of course, other resources too. I just had a question, Mike. If someone hasn't worked with a vet to do any testing for their small flock, how does that go usually? Like, what does that process look like?
So, I mean, I've always recommended, and it's far easier said than done. Before you get chickens, you need a vet. And then once you have chickens, it's too late to go hunting for a vet. And so if you don't have a vet right now, that should be priority number one. So there are several ways. I mean, you can do it organically and start calling around. Another good resource is to call the College of Veterinarians of Ontario, the CVO. They are our organizing body. And every year when we get our licenses, we're asked what animals we see and what we're willing to see. And so they have a list of not all the vets across Ontario, but all the vets that named themselves or indicated that they would look after backyard flocks. They have a list of those by geography. So call the College of Veterinarians of Ontario. They're in Guelph. I don't know their number, but they're easily findable. And ask them what vets in your area are willing to see backyard poultry. Then call them. And you may have to actually go in for a visit and pay a visit fee to become an actual client. But once you do that, then you've got access to veterinary care. You've got access to after hours calls and things like that for when you need them. Because the last thing you want to do at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night is try and call around because you've got a bird that's jumped off a fence and broke her wing. You need to have that lined up beforehand.
Right. And that relationship and all that established. That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to invite our other panelists to pop back on screen here. Got a few questions coming up. So someone is curious about deep litter. So they've been doing a lot of reading. Is that not adding to the ammonia and the methane load in the coop?
I guess I brought that up, should I? So I should do that, eh? I'd actually be happy for Mike to jump in too, because I mean, he sees lots of poultry barns. I guess there's two things I'll say quick. Some of the people participating will be dealing with concrete floors, and some of the people listening will be dealing with wooden floors, right? Like some of you have your buildings on piers and wooden floors. And again, it's a difference depending on what you're feeding. Certainly if you have a bird like layers that are a very high throughput feed animal, that litter will get wetter. So yes, in short, litter holds moisture. So it becomes a balance of how clean you keep that litter. So yes, it is more resource intensive to put down more litter and keep it cleaner. But, Mike, if you can speak to like broiler barns, when they fire up a broiler barn and place chicks, I mean, there's multiple inches of product put down to do that, right?
Yeah, it's actually a really incredibly complex ecosystem. In the US, they actually don't clean out broiler barns between flocks, and there will be 3 or 4 feet of litter and manure that they put new chicks on. But what happens is it ends up, part of it starts to compost, and that creates some heat, which is really nice in the winter. And then ideally the manure, the water, and the humidity will sink down a couple inches, not actually be in contact with the birds. And then the lower, and you can feel it. Like if you rub with your toe, there's some fluffy granular stuff, and then you get down into denser, almost moist, but it's not really moist, but it's just thick and dense. That actually provides some heat, but it also has an ecosystem where ammonia isn't really produced because of the type of bacteria that are in there. Management is crucial. So I've seen deep litter barns where they use pine needles as their litter, and that did not hold enough moisture to compost, and that place was just rancid and acidic. Like it was actually burning feet. Okay, so if you're going to do it, there's information out there. Get it from a good source, but make sure that you are managing it properly, because that's the key to most of it. You can have thin litter, keep it clean, and keep it fresh, or you can have deep litter as long as you only really stir up the top 1.5 inches and let the rest of it sit there and actually start to compost and let the bugs do their work.
Mm. So would there be a difference, Mike, then between the commercial size barn being more conducive to a deep litter pack versus something like a small flock shed or barn? Or would it work either way?
Yeah, it doesn't matter on size so much. What we can do in the commercial world is ventilate so much more precisely.
Mm.
So we've got every barn that I go into has between $15,000 and $20,000 worth of computers and sensors, automatically controlled fans, automatically controlled inlets, and they're measuring CO2, they're measuring ammonia, and ventilating to all those things. You can't do that as a small flock.
Right.
You need to do a lot more a lot more magic, where you just make sure that it feels fresh, it feels dry. But that's the biggest difference, is just how precise the commercial barns are.
Okay. Thank you. So we just need, this next question is a little bit of a refresher on what happens if your flock does test positive for high-path avian influenza. Just quickly, what is the process there as far as how the birds get managed at that point?
So I think that's for me up here. So yeah, if your flock does get tested positive for avian influenza, CFIA team will come into your premise and will do a site assessment, and based on that, there will be a depopulation done for the birds that are left over. In regards to like the pay, it's not the same as the BSE. So the carcasses that are depopped, it will be either buried or they will go to a landfill, depending on certain criteria, and that would be assessed when we do a site assessment. And the compensation is paid on depopulation. So anything that CFIA orders, we do pay compensation on depop and disposal. So that will be covered by us.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a question about hawks flying at someone's coop several times a day, every day for the last few weeks. They seem to be very healthy, but maybe very hungry. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about how to maybe deter these hawks, but also is there a worry with them carrying AI?
So I can handle whether they carry AI part of it. So hawks are susceptible to AI. We have seen a number of different species of hawks that have died as a direct result of this infection. We see it in a number of different raptor species, most often in the ones that are scavenging. So we see it mostly in the bald eagles and turkey vultures. But as I mentioned, some of these hawks will scavenge as well. So we have seen it in those species, as well as a number of owls too. When we talk about carriers, typically we're talking about birds that will carry the virus for a long period of time and not become as severely ill with that. So we don't consider hawks to necessarily be like a long-term carrier, but while they are infected with it, they can transmit the virus to different places. So that is a concern if you do have hawks that look sick on your property, at least.
Christoph, do you want to talk about deterring pests like that?
What do you want me to say?
How to be nice to the bird while you're inviting him to find a new home?
Yeah, and I guess, that's one of the things that some folks struggle with in terms of, how does one say this politely? I guess there's different tolerances for hawks, right? For amongst some of the folks that'll be on this call. And I guess, yeah, the only issue is, shutting off feed supplies. So some of you are dealing with flying birds, okay? Some of you are dealing with birds that go out and train and come back, etc. So there's this balance of having your birds be able to return home and late entry doors and all this sort of thing, and keeping hawks out. I mean, you just got to be on top of it. I don't know what else to say. As for the other pests, yeah, you guess you got to do what you got to do.
Right.
The one thing that I've seen work with flying birds is that hawks need to swoop to come down. So even stringing a bunch of wires or lines across, the flight zone. So whichever direction they like to fly, east to west or north to south, string some lines across there, and it makes it harder for them to swoop down in, and that has helped to deter them somewhat. They don't like to, or they aren't able to come in across as well if you can put up a bunch of different levels and various spots where there's wires that they can't swoop through very easily.
It's kind of counteracting some of their natural behaviors there. So here's a question. Veterinarians generally do not encourage medicating birds as a preventative measure and are suggesting only to medicate when birds are sick with the proper medication. Can you explain why feeding medicated birds every day of the week is okay and does not encourage resistance to medication?
So it has to do with the mechanism of action of the drug itself. Amprol is a thiamine antagonist, but it only works on the thiamine receptors on the cocci. So what happens is you starve that bug of a nutrient that it needs, and then it dies. But it doesn't actually have an effect on avian or mammalian species. And the reason that there isn't resistance to it is because the Amprol actually works on basically every bug, and none of them survive. So it would be kind of like, you can have people that are more resistant to a poison or whatever, but if you take oxygen away, you'll never become resistant to a lack of oxygen. You just can't have a subtle enough change that you could evolve to that. And so it's the same idea. The Amprol's been used super effectively since the 50s. And I still have never seen a flock that didn't respond to it, if it was actually cocci. I've had people that treated flocks they thought were cocci and they didn't get better, but it was because it wasn't cocci. So the reason that anticoccidial drugs like that work that well is because the change to the bug would have to be incredibly drastic for them to develop resistance. Now, some of the other coccidiostats, some of the ionophores and chemicals, they get resistant to very quickly because it only takes a subtle change for them to be able to evade the mechanism. But Amprol is good because it just completely is unavoidable to normal birds.
Ashley, I guess if I can just jump in following on what Dr. Patrick just said, I guess one of the things that I think not everyone appreciates is that not all medications, Mike was trying to go there, talking about the chemistry. Not all the medications used are antibiotics, right? So the big concern at this point in time is, throwing antibiotics and everything. So just because a feed is medicated, and using this example that was just put out, does not mean it's antibiotics. Right. So, and you'll see that across species, across agriculture, that there are some medications that are not deemed to be antibiotics. So those are they're more freely available, right? And there's this difference in terms of, routine use versus prescription use.
Okay.
So yeah, that's why you can get it in feed off the floor at the feed mill, right?
Thank you. So we just have a question about what shavings you recommend, fine, medium, or coarse?
I would like Mike to jump in on this one too, but I'll just say it depends on what you want to do. Again, those of you that are dealing with flying birds, you don't want to deal with coarse shavings because they'll just pile up. Like you have no control over their placement anymore because they just pile up around the outside of whatever containment you're in, right? Like they'll just move. So in those cases, you're going to use fine or some mixture of fine and coarse. And then, commercial poultry or, mid-size scale poultry, I guess there's more scope there, and I'll let Mike speak to that.
So I guess the the reality is that you're using your bedding as a sponge, and the smaller the pieces are, the more they absorb, but the less they filter. So if you have sawdust, wherever there's a wet spot, that spot is wet. That's it. If you have coarse shavings, some of that moisture will filter down through. Some of it will get absorbed, but you can still have dry shavings on top of, the deeper, wetter stuff. And so it's a balance depending on your ventilation and the activity of your birds. You want them to be able to scratch it up. You want them to be able to turn the litter themselves and keep it from caking and that. So I've seen it all work. Generally, I like coarser as a rule. And what I would do is start off with relatively coarse shavings and then make them finer as you need it. If you're starting to see bare cement and bare wood from the birds' activity and them, just fooling around, then you may have to go to something finer than what you have. But you just have to stick handle that a little bit on your own as to how your coop works.
Okay. And just to build on that, are cedar shavings toxic, or do we prefer pine shavings instead? Any preference on wood type?
I prefer pine. Cedar is kind of oily, like just from, and so like you don't want to have any hardwood, obviously, like things like walnut are toxic. And that would be like actively bad. But pine shavings are fluffier and more absorbent, if you can describe it that way. And so I prefer those.
Okay. That makes sense. I'm going to give folks a minute if they have any other questions to add here. I just following up on your presentation, Christoph, we were talking about how do you do a good clean in the winter? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, and those are some of the slides of Al's that I didn't bring forward. Obviously we're now going to be getting into the freezing here shortly, right? So I mean, you could still get, especially if you have concrete floors or whatever, or washable surfaces, you could still power wash and those sorts of things now. You're going to run out of that option very soon. So part of that is why, we're talking about it tonight in terms of timing. And then once you're into frozen, or again, those people that are in all wood structures, like wood floors and everything, you just got to take it down to the wood and sweep and sweep and sweep, right? Unless you're going to get into, and I mean, we can go down the road, and you heard it last week. You learned all about the chemistry to get in and foam and all that stuff out. But if you're not going to go there, at the very least, you got to get it right down to the bare wood and sweep.
Okay. Try your best over the winter.
Oh, yeah. So, and again, and that becomes a balance, right? In terms of, the question's been asked about the deep litter and the ammonia and keeping it dry. You just got to keep at it. Like you can't just tell yourself it's going to freeze and leave it alone for the winter, which some people try to get away with.
Right.
That is not a good strategy.
Right.
Makes for a shitty day in January when it thaws, right? So
if January isn't tough enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Not seeing any more questions. Every time I say that, one more pops up. But Mike, I'm going to give you the mic to give a couple key takeaways of what you want people to look up. Oh, here we go. So just one more question about litter. Do you recommend using lime on the floor before you put shavings down, or when does lime come into play?
For me, lime is great if you've got a wet floor. So if you clean out and you've swept out and there's a wet spot in your floor, that spray lime, the white lime, absorbs it, dries it out, and it's like baby powder. Okay, so all you're doing, you're not actually fixing anything. You're not making anything better. All you're doing is covering up that area with something really dry and making it dry. It's acidic, so you have to cover it with shavings, because if they walk around on the lime and then it gets moist and sticks to their feet, it'll burn them. So, then you cover it with litter, but it's great in itself. It isn't a useful tool. other than it gets rid of moisture. So don't think that it's changing the the composition of the litter or whatnot effectively. But yeah, so if you have it, and it like baby powder, it only works until it's wet. So if you've got like a dirt floor that is always kind of damp and seepy, lime's not going to help with that. So, but yeah, it's good for mopping up. If you had a water spill, if you let the coop get a little bit damper than you should have, and everything's kind of soppy now, and you get it cleaned out, then lime's great.
Yeah, we have another interesting question about feed additives. So is there a feed additive that you can put in that will help control the ammonia in the winter?
Yeah, don't overfeed your birds. I mean, that is honestly it, right? Like ammonia in your litter evolves from protein in the ration. So, I mean, this is why when you go to the store, they have, high test feeds for high producing layers and low test feeds for lower producing layers, That's why that's there, because if you're overfeeding protein, you're putting more nitrogen through those birds and it evolves as ammonia from the litter.
Yeah, and that's it exactly. You can't give a feed additive that's going to absorb nitrogen if you keep giving them nitrogen every day, which is what protein is. So no, trust me, everybody has looked hard for that magic bullet, and we can't find it. If we do, we'll let you know. But no, controlling ammonia is exactly that: getting the balance of the nutrition right and managing your litter and ventilation. So it's hard and boring. Nobody likes it.
Yeah. Good question, though. I like that. Okay, Mike, I was trying to hand the last word over to you. If there's a couple key takeaways around this disease surveillance that you could give folks to think about.
Yeah, I think, again, these are all non-specific kind of squishy recommendations. Know your flock. You know your birds. You know what they do. You know what they should look like. If they don't look like that, you're the one who should notice it first. Be really aware that chickens are, they're the ultimate prey animal. Everybody eats chicken. And so over the years, they've evolved to hide absolutely every weakness they can. So I've seen chickens with broken toes walk around, never show a sign. Birds are really ill. You've got to really know your birds. You've got to really watch them. If they're not moving as much as they should, there's a reason for that. If they're not coming out of the coop in the morning, there's a reason for that. So manage your birds well. Try and keep their environment perfect. You won't, but try. So try and keep the air, fresh. Try and keep the litter, nice and crumbly and not wet, and keep that ammonia smell out of your coop. That goes a huge way to keeping your birds healthy. Chickens are actually quite robust. And so if you have a bird in a good environment and you insult them with a bunch of virus, really a lot of times they'll just kind of truck on through and it's great. But it's keeping them in that real comfortable place that makes them tough. If you have them in an environment where they're struggling because for every minute you go into an ammonia filled coop, they've been in there for 16, 18 hours. So, it's like having a puff off a cigarette versus being a chain smoker. Right. And it's so being, if the environment's a little bit off, they're in that all the time. And so it starts to really build on them and really use up a lot of their resources to deal with that. That makes them able to get sick very easily. But really, that's it. There's no magic bullet. Try and get vaccinated birds. Try and keep them vaccinated. That's been a bit of a challenge because of avian influenza. But basically, treat them as good as you can. Keep their nutrition right and keep their environment right. And they're pretty tough.
Very cool. Thank you. So just one more thought that we had about the minister's order. Is anyone able to talk about where we're at with that?
Yeah, I guess it's going to have to be me, Ashley. So the advice I was given, so I asked some of our counterparts in the Animal Health and Welfare branch, because Lucy could not join us tonight. So this is the exact wording. So our Animal Health and Welfare branch is working on a risk assessment, which will inform the decision makers. So that to say, so that order expires in 12 days, I believe. If someone has the date handy. And I know there's people who are trying to make plans, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not here to tell you if it's being extended or not. My point is there are people working on that and they're conscious of everyone's concerns and bounce achieved. There is no foregone conclusion it's being extended. There is no foregone conclusion that it is ending for sure. Okay. So people just need to understand that I guess everyone's good behavior and low incidence numbers factors into that risk assessment that they'll be making next week.
Okay, thank you.
So that's kind of as good a news without any news as you can get.
Right. But we've been doing our job here in Ontario, as Mike mentioned at the start, is some good management's been happening. So that's all boding well for things. We have a couple more questions, actually. What's the recommendation for square footage for birds in a coop if you have around 15 birds? And is there any maybe place where someone could go and dig a little deeper into this?
So I can tell you the minimum requirements. If you look on the National Farm Animal Care Council's website, NFACC, NFAC, there is the care and handling of laying hens and pullets. Or if you have meat birds or turkeys, you can look at the meat bird code. That gives you bare minimums. That's around a square foot per bird. The reality is that when you have a coop, you need to think about the cubic feet per bird. Okay, you can have a heater in your coop, or you can have 15 little heaters in your coop, but it matters. The birds provide the majority of heat to keep the barn, their area warm. So if you have a really tall barn and they only have 2 square feet per bird, they can't keep that warm. If you've got a shorter barn and you've got them at 2 square feet per bird, they can keep that area warm. And so it's more complicated than just square footage. The square footage, they need to have, basically a square foot per bird at a minimum. And you want to have it tight enough in the winter that they can keep the barn warm while still keeping the cold air that's coming in able to circulate. So you need to have enough heat produced in that shed that you can still allow fresh air to come in and mix and still not get too cold for those birds. So again, a non-answer, and I apologize for that, but it does depend a lot on your situation, how insulated your coop is, and how much volume is in that box, more so than the footprint of it.
Okay. And I just posted a link to that National Farm Animal Care Council, and all of those codes of practice are listed on their website there. So we have a question, sounds like from a producer, just recovered from an HPAI case and is placing 20,000 turkeys again in 2 weeks. Just wondering how long could avian influenza survive in the straw bale shed if it were in there in new bales? This question is a little too outside of our zone. We can certainly follow up with this person.
I mean, probably Lucy would be the best one to answer this one. In general,
Lucy.
It depends on the temperature that's happening with the straw bale. So warmer temperatures are going to kill the virus faster, but if it's colder, it's going to survive longer. But right. Lucy is the one who would probably be able to answer this. So
yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna maybe I'll just shoot you my email to the person who asked that question, and then if you want to follow up with me, we can connect you with somebody who can hopefully follow up with you. So that's a great question. Okay, we've made it. It's 7:30. Cleared the question queue. Provided some good stuff here. So thanks again to all of our panelists for being here. Vaishnavi, have a great holiday when you take off. Very nice to work with you over the last number of weeks, and looking forward to getting Tori back on the roster here. Nothing more, but we have a couple new speakers coming up next week and moving forward. So looking forward to seeing you all then. Until then, take care.